Hello, everybody. My name is Sean McDonald, and I'm going to talk a little bit about personal environmental communication. If you know anything about me, you know that I care deeply about personal communication, environmental communication in general. And when I think about personal communication, I think of it as just one aspect of environmental communication, along with sort of institutional communication or public communication. When I think about personal communication, the sort of the professional or environmental realm, I think um, one of the things that comes to my mind, and probably comes to your mind, is this idea of networking, right, or professional networking. And probably if you're thinking about professional networks, you know, ideas come into your head, visions of people in business suits exchanging business cards, and it's all very formal, and there's cocktails, and that's true. That is that's part of professional networking. But the truth is, all animals are involved in social networks, right? Humans, just like other animals, we are hardwired to want to partake in networks and networking, the exchange of information. In this case, it's sort of the exchange of professional information, professional contacts should be sort of second nature to us. We get too hung up on the idea of it being formal, and that I think makes it difficult. So I'm going to give you some tips today, hopefully, that should make the process of professional environmental communication or personal communication a little bit easier. So let's talk about networking a little bit more. Well, first of all, I think that with networking, we got to break it down to the basics, right? If you want to be successful in professional networking, you want to take it to that sort of professional level, you need to set goals for yourself. Decide what you want to get out of your professional networking experience. Generally, that means determining who it is that you need to speak to, and what you might need to find out in order to further your professional environmental career. Um, One of the things that I like to point out is, unlike the sort of formal wear and business cards and cocktail networking events, um, a lot of networking takes place spontaneously. It can be just regular, fairly mundane interactions we have with the people around us. So I would say build networking into your daily life. Really put time into cultivating and growing your network, sort of the connections of people that you talk to about professional information. Part of networking is being able to tell your story in a conversational way. And later on in this lecture, I'll talk a little bit more about how you can sort of get into the habit of telling your own story and communicating about your interests. So we'll table that for now. But I think generally, in terms of like a process for networking, it's a good idea to think about networking, not about trying to get something transactional from someone else, but focusing on relationships with other people. Focusing on friendships is actually not a bad place to start. Hey, we start from an early age. We're told, hey, focus on friendships. Like I feel like I watched some educational videos about that as a child. We can all be friends. Um, but if you really do think about starting off these networking with starting off your networking activities with thinking about building relationships with others, then that I think that's a much more positive way to look at it. Uh, the other thing is, if you work on having those relationships with other people, then when networking or when professional opportunities arise and they're thinking of people that they know and like, they're going to reach out to you. And so it's just beneficial to focus on the relationship aspect of things rather than the transactional aspect of networking. Um, Places to go to do some of this. I said some of it can be informal, just day-to-day interactions with people, but you can also get involved with professional groups and organizations, like-minded groups and organizations. That's a great place to start. And because I said so much of this happens spontaneously, it's never a bad idea to have business cards and updated resumes handy pretty much at all times. A story I like to tell is about a former student who was looking for a job high and low, spent many weeks applying for things and not having a lot of luck, and then ran into an acquaintance at a grocery store, struck up a conversation, told this acquaintance about trouble he was having finding work, and asked for some advice. And that person had an idea, asked for his resume. He just happened to have an updated one handy, so he sent it off to her that same night. And the next day, he had an interview scheduled. And it turned out to be a really successful professional endeavor for him. So you never know when things are going to pop up. So being ready at all times is not a bad thing. All right, so that's just a little bit about networking to start off with. I do want to start by talking about some digital and social tools for professional communication. One of the things that I focus a lot of attention on in my classes is the use of social networks, such as Twitter. I think Twitter is a really good social platform that also has a strong networking capacity or capability, and it can work really well, really effectively in a professional setting. There's a lot of interaction there, the exchange of information, professional ideas. So it can be really, I think, among the various social platforms, one of the most useful for professional environmental communication. Some of the things that I might point out, though, well, another platform that I really like, and this is actually not as much a social platform, but it is a hub or I say a landing portal that you might consider, is this site called About Me. This is an About Me site for a really well-known science communicator, Liz Neely. She's done quite a bit. She's actually previously been involved with Compass Online. She turned me on to this. Basically, About Me is a way for you to get a free landing site that is essentially has a URL that is your name, and then you can link all of your other online or digital platforms and media on this site. So this is the About Me Liz Neely site. I have one myself, and you can just put a little blurb about yourself and link in your various platforms. It's a great spot or a great portal to share with other people and connect them with all of your online information. One of the other popular professional online social sites, though, that many of you have probably heard about is LinkedIn. And I've heard from several other students who've asked me for advice about LinkedIn. I will say that a great starting point is to go to the University of Washington Career Center. They have a lot of great information about setting up a LinkedIn site, about things that you may want to consider in putting together your LinkedIn site. They do, I think, some webinars and some tutorials as well. I check that out. But I'll just give you my 2 cents about LinkedIn. I think it's a really useful professional networking site as well, along with Twitter. I think that the two work really well hand in hand. They sort of serve slightly different audiences. So that can give you good exposure and also help you make some really useful connections too. This is a site from a former student of mine who's done a really nice job putting together many, I think, useful elements. And so I'm just going to walk through some of the things that I think are extremely useful when developing your own LinkedIn site. And as I said, check out the UW Career Center for additional tips. But my LinkedIn tips, first of all, having good photos, a good profile photo, as well as a header photo. Those are just nice because they can attract some attention and they give you an opportunity to sort of express yourself creatively. I think that having an effective, useful, aspirational headline is quite handy. In the case of the student, his about section lets him sort of speak to what he's about and his experience as well, and so that works out nicely. The thing that I like about LinkedIn is it's sort of like having a living online resume, and in many ways can augment the static resume that you might turn in for a job and so on. A lot of, in fact, the majority of HR professionals will look for digital information about you online if they're entertaining you for a position. So having online material through your LinkedIn site that complements the material in your resume or at least supports it is really useful. So things like including important college classes, leadership experiences, work experiences, having all that in your LinkedIn site as well as your static resume is quite useful. But just like your static resume, you want to make sure you proofread it and that it is clear and concise and tells a useful story. One of the things that I tell many of my students is that a resume, just like a LinkedIn site, similar, these are marketing pieces. They're not historical documents. So you don't have to include everything about your professional experience from babysitting back in junior high or your paper route. You really just need to include the things that you think support the story you want to tell about yourself. I'm not asking you to lie, not asking you to fib, but you want to go ahead and market yourself and market your skills and market yourself as a professional. One of the things you can do through LinkedIn is join alumni groups. So University of Washington alumni or your departmental alumni page as well. An additional feature that I think is extremely useful on LinkedIn is that you can ask for recommendations and endorsements. And so you can get many recommendations, just little tiny recommendations or requests as recommendations from others. And those will appear on your LinkedIn site and can be extremely useful if someone is looking for information about you, they'll see those things. So those are just my couple of tidbits about LinkedIn. As I said, the UW Career Center has a lot more information there, and I'm happy to help as well if you want to set up a time to talk about your LinkedIn profile. I should mention that in addition to having a site, like any other sort of social network, you can share information with others. It's a great way to look for job postings, to share postings with your contacts, or to share other information. And in some ways, just like Twitter, it can be used to help establish your credentials as an expert in your field. By sharing information out with others, you then become a resource for professional information about your particular niche or your particular interest. All right, I mentioned back when I started talking about networking that being able to tell your story is important. And I think a big part of telling your story is understanding your message or the message you want to share. I like to think of the messaging toolbox as having several components. And I like to put all these things together and use them in different ways at different times. So I want to talk a little bit about the message box, which is a product of Compass, which is it's a communications platform. I'll talk a little bit about the 2-minute pitch, the 30-second elevator pitch, as well as networking icebreakers. All of these things together help form your toolbox and can help contribute to successful networking. So let's talk about what's in your toolbox and about constructing a message in general. So things that you need to consider when constructing your message. You need to know your audience, you need to know your message, and you need to know your time. When I say know your audience, you need to know who you're speaking to, because every audience is going to have a different point of view, and you want to speak with people about the things that interest them, right? You want to know what they care about so that you can draft or customize your message for your audience. When I say you need to know your message, you need to really speak about a topic knowledgeably. And so knowing what it is you want to say and how you want to say it is pretty important. So practicing, writing something down. You don't need to over rehearse it to the point where you sound like a robot, but you do need to be well versed in the message you want to share with others. And you need to know your time. And when I say know your time, what I mean by that is know how much time you have with your audience. Recall, I just talked about your message box, your 2-minute pitch, your 30-second elevator pitch, and your networking icebreaker. Each one of those things takes a certain amount of time, right? If you only have a minute with someone, you're not going to launch into a very long story. So understanding how much time you have with your audience is really critically important. So about knowing your audience. Um, Knowing your audience is knowing the so what. What is going to interest them about what you're going to say? And I think I may have shared this with you before, but think about the message that you have that you want to share with someone else. Maybe it's the message of what you are interested in, a project you're working on, your passion. That is obviously important to you, but you need to know why it would be important to your audience. So think about passing that message through a prism, and that prism tells you, or that prism is sort of like what your audience perspective might be. And so then through that prism, you can sort of customize your message to suit the audience. So I said, you need to know your message as well. I think we all suffer from this, or we can suffer from this idea of the curse of too much knowledge. And that's when we're passionate about something, we care about something, we know a lot about something, and someone asks us about it, and we just unload on them. We just open up the fire hose of that information and we just let it rip. And that can be overwhelming to people. And so, that's where Chip and Dan Heath sort of coined this phrase, the curse of too much knowledge, because when we have so much knowledge and we want to share all of it with others, we can overwhelm them. So it's important when you're doing messaging, appropriate messaging, that you think about how you can dial that down and focus it in a way that you can gain the most impact. Things that you can do, first of all, when you're developing messaging, is you want to focus on core ideas, not necessarily sound bites, but you want to focus on those core ideas and you want to support that with additional details. I like this idea of simple, but not necessarily simplistic. I think we've all heard the expression dumb something down. When you dumb something down or you say you're dumbing it down, you're essentially insulting your audience in a way, right? We don't need to make it dumb. We just need to make it simple, right? Because that's how we teach other people things. We want our audience to feel empowered by that knowledge. We don't want to make them feel inferior because they didn't know about it. Eliminating jargon is important, especially when we start talking about complex environmental topics. It's very easy to get tied up in jargon. Think about sort of those, how to make terms easily understood in, as I said, the simplest way possible. And as I said, you want to take those main ideas and support them with sound bites, but also things like metaphors or statistics or anecdotes. Those other little details can really help people focus around the main ideas because it gives them something to hold on to. We don't want to be overly vague. One of the best messaging tools that I've ever been exposed to is the Compass message box. And I do a lot of exercises with the message box in class. Here's an example of what the message box looks like. And the thing that I think stands out to people when they first look at the message box is that it's not arranged like a typical linear paper or description from top to bottom, left to right. It's this box within a box with these different quadrants. Notice that you can indicate who your audience is up at the top. You might put the central issue in the middle. You have a quadrant for the problem, a quadrant for so what, a quadrant for the benefits, and a quadrant for the solutions. But it is specifically designed to not be linear. And the reason for that is that most academics, scientists, and others, environmental professionals, we have grown accustomed through academic reading to have a very linear approach to describing environmental issues. We start with sort of the overall arching title and the abstract, we go through the background, we have methods, results, discussions, and conclusions. And really, this might work for a paper, but it doesn't really work in conversation very effectively. So the idea behind the message box is it sort of short circuits that linear idea, and it forces us to think in a non-linear way, at least initially. So the components of the message box. And I think that any topic can be broken down into this message box format. The first thing, of course, is to identify your audience and the issue that you care about, but then talk about the problem. So what is the problem with this issue? And then, of course, think about why does this information matter to your listener? So what is the so what? Think about that prism that you're passing your message through. You're taking the problem, you're passing it through that prism, and it's helping us to determine the so what. Why does your audience care about this topic? Some examples. Maybe you're talking to a politician, and the so what is that this issue is making their constituents angry and upset. Maybe you're talking to a businessman, and this issue is going to cost them money. Maybe you're talking to an environmentalist or a conservationist, and this issue, or the problem rather, with this issue is that it's going to hurt populations of some endangered species. These could all be the same problem, but they might be, of course, as you pass that problem through the prism, it's impacting your audience in different ways. So the solutions, what are some of the possible solutions to this problem? And then last but not least, what are the potential benefits of resolving this problem? So what do we gain from enacting the solution to the problem? Usually this is in some ways a response to the so what. Maybe it's, it will resolve the problem, and so stakeholders and constituents will be happier. Maybe it'll save us tons of money, or maybe it will help restore the species of concern. Normally what I suggest to students is to take the message box format, the form, and fill it out by hand. And you can just write down with little bullets all of the things that you care about. This one is an example for an issue is how well connected are populations of marine organisms on coral reefs, and it discusses some of the problems with identifying those connections, and it kind of goes into more detail. But what you see is there's a lot of bullets, and this is what we might see in sort of an early draft of a message box, where you can go ahead and just write down all of the things, and you might have quite a few details here and there. And I would encourage you to start with writing everything down, everything in the kitchen sink, and you can later go through and refine it, and cut the details that maybe aren't necessary. I like to think of developing a message box as an iterative process. We'll talk more about that in a second. But I'll put something together, I'll run it by someone, and I'll refine it, cut it down, or maybe tweak it to make it clearer. And I've used the message box a lot over the years. On the Canvas site that I use for my classes, I generally have a page where I show some examples of message boxes that I put together for my own research. And I use these in a number of different settings. Most frequently when I do media engagements or interviews. So one example was for a radio story I did about geoduck farms, since I do geoduck aquaculture research. I've included this on my Canvas site, and I will provide a link to it for the class. But I would encourage you to listen to the radio story and look at my message box at the same time, and you'll see that I use the message box in the interview to respond to some of the questions that I was asked by the interviewer. So, some tips for you as you're putting together a message box. Focus on the big picture and support it with details, because obviously we want the audience to understand the big picture, but the thing that helps them connect to those big picture ideas are those details. Avoid being overly generalistic or simplistic. It's hard for someone, as I said, to understand what it is you're talking about if you don't give them some level of detail. So there is that is something else to consider. It is oftentimes a balancing act between being accurate and being compelling, because you want to tell a story, and you want to understand, your audience wants to understand the story, but they want to understand your connection to it. So think about it that way. I'll talk a little bit more about storytelling in a second. And as I said, the message box is the process of refining the message box is iterative. And so frequently your final version will look nothing like your first. Don't get hung up on the details initially, just write everything down, get feedback from others, get feedback from me, get feedback from your classmates, refine, refine, refine until you get comfortable with something that you can share with other people. All right, so that's the message box. Now the message box is, as I said, fairly non-linear, and it's really good for responding to questions or having a conversation with someone. But that's not always the right tool for your personal and environmental communication. So the next tool in the toolbox I like to talk about is the 2-minute pitch. And so what I like to think about with the 2-minute pitch is to take elements of the message box and then draft that up into maybe more of a narrative form. And so you can really tell a story where you're hopefully the protagonist in that story. The guy in the background here is Randy Olson. He's a marine biologist that became a filmmaker and a storyteller. And he is a really big fan of this idea of using narrative and storytelling to communicate ideas, whether they be big ideas or small ideas. He points to a lot of neuroscience research that shows that the human brain is hardwired to appreciate a good story. Maybe this dates back to our early ancestors, but we understand more clearly and we engage more thoroughly with others when they're telling us some bit of information through story. And Randy Olson, it can be very compelling because he tells he talks about this as if he's telling a story. He talks about MRI scans of people while they're listening to stories and talking about different parts of the brain that light up. And again, very compelling stuff. But think about, as you draft up a message box, to think about how you can make it a narrative and tell a story. I generally think it's a good idea to draft something like this up and draft it up as if you are talking about it. Don't make it overly formal. Write something out and then say it out loud and ask yourself, does this sound like me? Does this sound like I'm having a conversation with someone? It's really important to be conversational. Okay, so speaking of conversational, I do want to talk about what I think of as the 12 C's of a good pitch. And I'm not going to go through all 12 of them. Here they are right here. I'm going to talk about 4 of them that I think are particularly important when we're doing any sort of messaging. I mean, all of them are probably important, but there are 12, so we're not going to go through every single one. First thing is you want to be concise, right? I mean, I know I talked about the message box, but I also talked about this thing called the 2-minute pitch and the 30-second elevator pitch. You really do want to be concise. Obviously, knowing your time is part of that. You also want to be coherent. Just like the curse of too much knowledge, opening up that fire hose, if you let it all rip, you might not necessarily sound very coherent or easy to understand. So focus on telling a compact and coherent story. The other one I have underlined up here is creative. It's a great idea to be creative because that's really what's going to get somebody excited about what it is you're having to say. You don't want to be boring. Having a good hook, it can be useful, but also think about creative storytelling as well. And then, as I said already, conversational. Be conversational because you want this to be the exchange of ideas with others. You want to enter into a conversation with another person or a group of people as part of any sort of networking or other personal environmental communication. All right, so we talked about the message box, talked a little bit about the 2-minute pitch. Sometimes having something longer or less narrative isn't what you want. Sometimes you need something short and sweet and to the point. That's where the 30-second elevator pitch comes in. The idea behind the elevator pitch, obviously, was this idea in business where you could hop on the elevator with someone, give them the pitch for this brand new business idea, and be done with the pitch by the time the elevator stops and the person wants to get off. Now, of course, we don't really do too much of that anymore, but the idea of being able to get your point across and make your pitch quickly and clearly, that sticks with us because it's useful, right? And we can use the 30-second pitch in a lot of different contexts, especially for networking. The things to remember, I think it's a good idea to start with your message box, maybe whittle it down to that 2-minute longer kind of story pitch. But then from there, break it down even further. It needs to be somewhere between 100 and 125 words in order for it to be short and sweet and to the point. Again, you want it to be conversational. Usually something like the 30-second pitch starts with a good hook. And then you need to tell that sort of clear story from there. Again, you can see from this example, if you read it, and you might want to pause me for a second so you could do so, that this has a lot of elements of the message box in it. And we've just simplified it down to the critical elements so that I could say this quickly to the point in 30 seconds, and then we can move on and continue to have conversation. Because really coming back to networking, that's what it's all about, right? You want to be able to share something with another person or group of people and then enter into that dialogue with them. You don't want to necessarily just be speaking at them. So that's the 30-second pitch, which I think can also be quite useful. And then since we were talking about networking in general, I think certainly sharing your details of your interests for your project with someone is a good way to network. But that's not the only thing that you need to do. So if you're thinking about that networking event where you're wearing your suit and tie and you've got your business cards, you're going to do more than just spew out your 30-second pitch for your idea, your interest, or your current project or your passion. You need to do some other things too. So here's some other ideas that I think can be quite helpful. You see some of these will, we've already sort of talked about this idea of talking shop, or talking about your background, or talking about an ongoing project, but other things that you can do, because really, let's face it, human beings like to talk, but we especially like to talk about ourselves. And we are vain creatures. So, you can start with a compliment, especially a professional one. You can introduce yourself and ask them about themselves as well. You could talk about your background and any shared interests you have, whether those be professional interests or, as I said, you can get personal, talk about personal interests or hobbies. You can ask them about what's interesting to them about their field, about the projects they're working on. You can ask them what they hope to gain from the experience of networking. For all of you, because you are new to the field, maybe perhaps lack a little bit of experience, and you might be networking with people who are more senior or more established, you can ask them for help. You can ask them questions. You can ask them for their perspective. Again, we are vain people who are vain creatures that like to talk about ourselves. And so if you ask someone else what their opinion is, or to ask them to talk about something they're working on, chances are they're going to jump at the chance. So these are just a couple of examples that I think can be quite useful for starting a conversation or continuing a conversation. And you can, of course, insert your 30-second pitch, your 2-minute pitch as needed, or just have your message box in your back pocket so that you can respond with tidbits of information if someone starts asking you questions. My hope is that if we work on these things together, that this can be a good place for you to start, and you can start using these tools in your day-to-day professional life, and as you start to expand your network. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'm always available to chat, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.